Good afternoon. I'm Molly LaFond. I'm a spiritual director and a parishioner right here at St. Peter the Fisherman Parish in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. Now, for you folks who are at a distance, Two Rivers is 90 miles north of Milwaukee on the shores of Lake Michigan and only 45 miles from Green Bay. Of course, everybody knows that's the home of the Packers. So if you ever travel our way over here, feel free to stop in. But another reason I want you to know that is this presentation is being live streamed rather than doing the stations in person around the church. The benefit of that is, even though it's going to be live streamed here at 1 o'clock as we are, you can tap into this video at any time after today's date, February 19th. Another thing too, you can pause it and take your time in reflecting and meditating and being in your own personal space as you do the stations. What you would do, if you mention this to other friends who might want to view this, it will be on Facebook at St. Peter the Fisherman, Two Rivers, Wisconsin, or YouTube. And various presentations, as well as daily masses and Sunday masses, will be on that YouTube too. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you, and I want to thank the pastoral associate, Deacon Paul Gleichner, our sacramental priest, Father Dave, the pastoral team, John LaRoche, Sheila Bialik, and I also want to thank Sister Jerry Ann Stelmach, may she rest in peace. She's the one that did these stations. I have fashioned my own stations after the words that she made for her stations. I made these just last week out in my husband's workshop. So I'll just be putting them up. I wanted to show you how easy it is to make your own stations. So I want to explain to you why I'm thrilled to be here. The stations were never anything that I was excited about. And as a kid, we were herded into church, and the priest went around the perimeter of the church, and I think they were the old-fashioned stations where you genuflect and stand up. We praise you, O Lord, and we bless you, but by your holy cross, you have redeemed the world. That's all I remember. I don't remember anything touching my heart. But in the last few years, as I have prepared for different presentations, I discovered how neat the internet is. And I was looking up the stations, and it opened up the whole world for me. And then I found, if you'll see this on the table, different stations. And I was asking several friends if they knew the variety of stations that were out there. And they looked at me and shook their head no, they didn't know any of that. And many only remembered the old versions that I was referring to too. So I thought maybe this would be a nice presentation to share with you. And it's for those people who really didn't know much about the stations. And it's pretty basic. And one of the sites that has been very helpful for me is the Creighton University in Nebraska site. And it has a lot of how-tos and the history and different stations right on that. So that's a reference that you can refer to. And that's where I'm taking most of my notes from today. Today, the actual stations will be Mary's perspective. And that's much different than a third-person perspective. Mary was the first person there at the stations. She was right there with her son as he walked that road, that journey to his death and crucifixion. So this is Mary's version of the stations. Now, when I first read these particular stations, they were so touching, I couldn't finish them. And that really shocked me to no end. I was sharing this with a friend of mine who was a year ahead of me in college, and she taught religion to the young kids. She nearly jumped up in her chair and said, yes, that's what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to touch us. And she explained that she was teaching these to her own school children, and they got so emotional to tears that they had to stop the stations at that point. I couldn't believe it. I thought I was telling her something and I shouldn't have gotten so emotional over it. She said, no, that's what the stations are supposed to do for us. Touch us in the core of our being so we really understand what Jesus went through for our sake. It's a prayer. It's a meditative prayer. We take the time to get into the skin of Jesus as he walked down that road. And through Mary's eyes, these particular stations to me are very touching. So if you experience that today too, the benefit of doing the stations this way in a stationary setting is you can put your button on pause. And if you only do one station a day, or 2 stations a day, or if you choose to do all 14, that's perfectly okay. See, I never knew that. I thought you had to take 20 whole minutes and go around the church, genuflect, come up, repeat it, and it was boring, really mundane. But these hopefully will offer you a new way of looking at the stations. So do you really know what the stations are about? Do you know how many there are? The variety of stations? There are 14 stations, and some make 15, which allows for the resurrection. But in days before that, there were only 12 stations. Now Mary, she put the different stations in her own home, and of course there were less than 14 at that point. But she was the first one who had the stations. The stations, people were able to go right over to Jerusalem and to walk the road that Jesus walked on his journey. But it became such that that wasn't feasible anymore. So in the 15th century, I believe it was the 15th century, the churches had plaques that they put around the walls of the churches. And these plaques were the pictures of the stations. And they call it stations. Think of a train going into a train station. It comes into the station and stops, pauses, loads up again, and goes to the next station. So that's why these are called the stations. We walk, people in the early days walked this road, this journey where Jesus did. And then they stopped at the important places. It's usually done in Lent, and we're beginning Lent as we did this week on Ash Wednesday. So this is a wonderful prayer to pray. It's usually done during Lent, usually on the Fridays, but it can be done at any time, any day. I have a few notes here that I don't want to forget to explain. The different versions of the Stations of the Cross, this took me by surprise. There are Stations of the Cross prayed by Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, Padre Pio, the Way of the Cross by Saint Alphonsus Liguori, and that's the old one that I think we learned as kids. There's a Station of the Cross for kids, for the poor souls in purgatory. Mother Angelica from EWTN, I just listened to that the other night. The stations I listened to, she wrote for herself. And there are other names for the Stations of the Cross too. The Way of the Cross, Via Crucis, or the Way of Sorrows, and the Stations of the Cross. Another tidbit that took me by surprise was the name of the stations that we meditate on the resurrection after the Passion of Christ, and that's called Via Lucis, the Way of Light. I've even thought of taking these and then putting those stations on the back. So the stations are a spiritual pilgrimage that we contemplate this passion of Jesus Christ. Some dioceses have their school children even demonstrate the Stations of the Cross in a play form, in, what would you call it, a play? The kids put on this play, the Stations of the Cross. I never knew that you didn't have to go to church to do the stations. And I remember a few years back at another parish, the pastor said, "Come to church, we're going to do the stations on Friday." And boy, the old time message was, as much as you say this is going to be interesting, I couldn't get into it. But now knowing that we can do it at home, we can do it in our own time. If you didn't even make your own stations, you could put a piece of paper on the walls at home. I'm going to take these up to our cabin and put them outside when it gets a little bit warmer. 5 below doesn't cut the mustard. How do you do the stations? If you go to this site, there's a page that simply says how to do the stations. It's easy. It's more than just reading the stations through. If you just read it, there's nothing to it. But by pausing and pondering and reflecting and putting ourselves into that presence of where Jesus is in that station, that becomes a real heartfelt prayer. And that's the thing that is so neat. It's just important to remember that it becomes as personal as we want it to be. Now there are some what ifs, and someone brought this to my attention, and this is cool because we can pause that little button on the computer and say, what if? What if Mary never said yes to begin with? What if Jesus had never been born? What if he was never crucified? What if Simon was never pushed out from that crowd to help him carry that cross? What if Simeon had not shared with Mary the swords that would pierce her heart? What about those very swords of our own that have pierced ours? These are the very things that we can pause for as we do these stations. Now let's take time to pray the stations through Mary's eyes. If you'll clear out any clutter in your mind, in your heart, any distractions, visualize putting them in a bag outside the door You can pick these up and tend to them after we finish. Picture yourself in Jesus' time. Try to concentrate, meditate, contemplate on the sign rather than me reading them. I'm going to take my time slowly. I'm not going to rush. If you need to pause your computer, you can always pick it up later on. Another thing, too, I want to share with you before we begin. If ever you want to get in touch with me, my name is Molly LaFond. I hope you can see that the way the camera's set up. That's my email. And right above is the Creighton University sign-in, where all of this can be found, what I'm sharing with you. Okay. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Mary, my mother, you were the first to live the way of the cross. You felt every pain and every humiliation. You were unafraid of the ridicule heaped upon you by the crowds. Your eyes were ever on Jesus and his pain. Is that the secret of your miraculous strength? How did your loving heart bear such a burden and such a weight? As you watched him stumble and fall, were you tortured by the memory of all the yesterdays, his birth, his hidden life, and his ministry? You were so desirous of everyone loving him. What a heartache it was to see so many hate him, hate with a diabolical fury. Take my hand as I make this way of the cross. Inspire me with those thoughts that will make me realize how much he loves me. Give me light to apply each station to my daily life and to remember my neighbor's needs in this way of the pain. Obtain for me the grace to understand the mystery, the wisdom, and the divine love as I go from scene to scene. Grant that my heart, like yours, may be pierced through by the sight of his sorrow and the misery, and that I may determine never to offend him again. What a price he paid to cover my sins, to open the gates of heaven for me, and to fill my soul with his own Spirit. Sweet Mother, let us travel this way together, and grant that the love in my poor heart may give you some slight consolation. Amen. The first station. Jesus is condemned to die. My son stood before Pilate as an innocent man, but throughout his life he entered more and more deeply into the condition of sinful flesh. It was not enough that he was born of a human mother like me. He grew up in obscurity in Nazareth. And they always judged him there. They always judged that it wasn't right that he was conceived before Joseph and I were married. Even when he began his public ministry, the religious leaders didn't accept him. His reflection of God didn't fit their self-serving picture of God. Finally, his own followers abandoned him. I never imagined he would have to experience solidarity with prisoners, beaten and tortured, but he did. I'll never forget the blood he shed and the pain he experienced at the hands of the Roman guards. Jesus began this journey by becoming one with every powerless person, mocked and made fun of by others. He did nothing that deserves capital punishment or the abuse he was given. His yes, his surrender to God's will, ultimately destroyed the power of sin and death. While he was growing up, I told him many times how I had been graced to say, "Let it be done to me according to your word." I never could have imagined that this would be the sword that would ultimately pass through my heart, to watch my son say yes to God so completely and fully for the salvation of the world. Now that he is condemned to death, reflect with me on each station of this journey, entering more and more completely into our humanity and death itself. Let us ask for God's grace to be with him and to accompany him on his journey to more fully understand it and be more fully grateful for the gift. The second station, Jesus carries his cross. My son was forced to carry the cross on which he would be nailed, ridiculed, and executed. We must pause here to remember what it represents. For this journey, he takes up the weight of all our crosses, all of our senseless suffering, and the weight of all the sin in the world, past, present, and future. Each step he took cut deeply into his already battered shoulders. I couldn't believe he could manage even a few steps. We can look back now and remember that this is all for us. Each of us can say it was for me. As we imagine each step he takes, we can pause now to say thank you in our own words, deep in our hearts. The third station. Jesus falls the first time. I can barely express to you what it was like to see my son fall under the weight of that cross. Everything within me wanted to make them stop. This was already too much. But there was nothing I could do but watch him lay on the ground. Of course, I now know that if he was to enter completely into our lives, he would have to surrender to the crushing weight of the burdens so many in their world suffer. All the people of the earth who are overcome by unfair burdens will always know that, laying there on the ground, Jesus knew and would always understand their powerlessness. Unable to get himself up, he entered into and forever understands our fatigue and whatever unfairly defeats us. I understand your sorrow and feeling of guilt at reflecting upon my son's way to Calvary. Please, just be grateful. my Son simply wants us to remember how He loved then and loves us now. This is all about His mercy and the gift of life we have in Him. The fourth station. Jesus meets His mother. As I pushed and shoved to move through the crowds to be as close to my son as I could, we came to a place in the road where he stopped. He saw me, and we looked into each other's eyes. I didn't want him to see my tears or know my pain, but I long ago accepted how thoroughly he knew me. The love from my heart poured out in the only embrace I could give him. My lips quietly said a prayer, the prayer he taught us. Father, may your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He nodded so slightly, took a deep breath, and moved on up the hill. The sword passing through my heart had blessed his mission, and I knew he knew it. Thank him with me even now that he took up that mission for us. Thank him that he has tasted the separation and loss that every person in the world knows who has lost a loved one. And he has understood the heart of every loving mother who grieves at the suffering of her children. He has become so completely one with us. The fifth station. Simon helps Jesus carry his cross. Now reflect with me on what it must have been like for my son to simply not be able to carry the cross any further alone. I was so relieved that he was getting help at the time, even though my heart went out to Simon, who was drawn into Jesus' journey. As we look back, we can give thanks that Jesus entered into our life, even in the gesture of help. Jesus came to know the experience of all of us who must depend on others, who can't make it alone. Even in this final journey, Jesus would not even have the satisfaction of being able to do this on his own. Let's pause for a moment to express to him now whatever is in our hearts. The sixth station. Can you get me some water? Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. I can't describe his face with the blood and the sweat and the bruises and swelling from the beatings. As a mother, I can hardly tell you that there was even spit on his face. It was the face of solidarity with all who have ever experienced abuse and violence. Then out of the crowd came a woman whose compassion for my son was so great that she pushed past the Roman soldiers and wiped his face with her veil. Oh, how I loved her for that. The look between them touched me deeply. His clean face, for a moment, revealed the lovely face of the son I loved. As he smiled at the woman and continued on the journey, those of us nearby looked at her veil and saw the gift that he gave her. There on her veil was a stunning likeness, a true icon of the cost of his sacrifice and the depth of his solidarity with all who suffer. This image is his gift to us forever, to always contemplate his likeness, his union with us in our worst rejection and suffering. As you remember with me how his face was so covered with punishment and violence, let us give thanks for his solidarity with us in every aspect of our lives. The seventh station. Jesus falls the second time. When my son fell the second time, my heart sank as he seemed to just lose control and stumble and crumble to the ground. The way he fell to his knees on the hard stones, I could feel the jarring pain through my whole body. Helpless to help him, I again wondered if he could make it. As I look back with you today, I imagine that this fall placed him together with people with disabilities, with people suffering from all kinds of physical diseases that weaken them, and with all who are aging and must confront the limits of their bodies. My prayer is that all God's people who know the suffering of these disabilities might know that they can always turn to my son for understanding and comfort. With gratitude in our hearts, we take a few moments to find the words to express our feelings to him. The eighth station. Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. This moving scene filled my mother's heart with even more love for him. As I had seen him comfort so many groups of people during his life, now he comforts this group of women and children in Jerusalem. They aren't here to condemn him. What a remarkable meeting. They try to comfort him as he looks on them with love and compassion. During his ministry, he had come to grieve for Jerusalem. Now, my son gives them a special mission. Soon they would understand that this suffering they witnessed so closely was for them. Soon they would witness the suffering of Jerusalem and have their chance to bring their compassion and faith to their children and the people of their city. It is good to reflect here with him on the mission each of us has that can be shaped by this encounter with our suffering, death, and resurrection for me. Thank him for this brief time to recall the gift we have received. The ninth station. Jesus falls the third time. I will always remember this final fall. Having endured such a beating and having lost so much blood, my son simply collapses. I saw him lay there on the ground, and I thought he was dead. His arms spread out and his face in the dirt. Jesus found himself in solidarity with all who fall in any way. Contemplating how the soldiers roughly pulled Jesus up and made him take the last steps to Calvary, take a few moments to speak with him, expressing your gratitude for his understanding for every weakness or failure you have ever experienced. The 10th station. Jesus is stripped. The sword passed through my heart again to watch my son so violated this way. They intended to shame him even more by executing him naked. They simply had to strip him of any dignity a human being could have left. I remember looking at his body. I had bathed and cared for. Now, with all his wounds reopened and bleeding, so exposed for everyone to see, now I see all the people in the world who are vulnerable and without any defense. All those whose dignity is violated. And I see this act of stripping as piercing my son so completely with those who suffer. His incarnation was about to be complete. Please pause to express what is in your heart and to give him thanks that this is all so that you might be free from the power of sin and death. The 11th station. Jesus is nailed to the cross. Today, as I remember him lying on the cross with his arms outstretched, it is the sound of the hammer hitting the nails that stays with me. I remember pulling the first of many wood splinters from his fingers as a child, working in Joseph's shop. Against his precious hands and wrist that touched and healed so many, a nail was placed and a hammer pounded the flesh through and through and into the wood of the cross. The sound, metal against metal, that ring, and the look on his face, the spasm of his whole body, I will never forget. Then the other hand and finally his feet are nailed to the cross. Spend some time with him now, imagining how they lifted him up on the cross, nailed there, that you might be free. The 12th station. Jesus dies on the cross. The sword of helplessness split my heart in two as I watched him struggle to breathe, pulling himself up to let air out of his lungs. With incredible courage and compassion, he spoke of mercy and love. There on that cross, he gave me to John and gave me to the Spirit-filled church that would be born on Pentecost. Then, after he gave himself into God's hands one last time, he took his last breath and died. It is unforgettable to watch life leave the body of someone you love. At the foot of his cross today, listen to my son tell you of his love for you. Speak to him from your heart. The 13th station. Jesus is taken down from the cross. We waited what seemed like a long time before we had permission to take his lifeless body off that cross. And it took so long to remove the nails and to finally lower his body to the ground. Someone removed that horrible crown of thorns from his head. They pulled his hair back and wiped his face clean before letting me hold his body one last time. He had been given to me for only a brief time. When he left home 3 years before, I was so proud of him and excited to experience what God would do through him. There at the foot of the cross, my heart torn by grief, but always trusting in God's promise. I asked only to be God's servant for what was ahead. After the ascension, when we would gather in homes for the breaking of the bread, I again held his broken body in my hands, now full of consolation that his promise was fulfilled. He would always be with us. Let yourself join me in receiving this mystery of the death of Jesus being so real and complete. Knowing the rest of the story, join me in speaking with him heart to heart about our gratitude for how he has transformed the power of death. Let yourself join me in receiving this mystery of the death of Jesus being so real and complete. Knowing the rest of the story, join me in speaking with him, heart to heart, about our gratitude for how he has transformed the power of death. The 14th station. Jesus is laid in the tomb. No mother should ever have to bury a child. No parent should ever have to bury a child. Just a short time before this day, Jesus looked into Lazarus' tomb. He must have known he would be laid in a tomb like that soon. And when he thanked God for hearing his prayer, he must have known that the Father who sent him would give him life that would never die. In just a few days, this tomb would be empty, and forever a sign of Jesus' surrender to the forces of sin and death for us. As we picture this scene, let us place the image of the empty tomb before our eyes. Whenever you are tempted to stand outside any tomb and grieve, remember this empty tomb and know that through the eyes of faith, all tombs are empty. Today, join me in giving him thanks. Join me in signing ourselves with the sign of the cross, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. As we conclude our time here together, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me here at St. Peter the Fisherman in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. If these stations have been helpful to you, feel free to share them with your friends and feel free to comment on your computers so the parish knows if it was helpful or not. It helps them to decide presentations for the future. God bless you, and have a holy and blessed Easter.